Okay, so we all know the shapes we see and interact with every day. Those are in three dimensions, length, width, height, right? But mathematicians, they like to go a bit further, exploring things that are much more abstract, like shapes in four dimensions. It's kind of mind-bending, actually. And recently there's been this huge breakthrough in how we understand these spaces, particularly how to classify them, like how to group them together based on how they can be deformed.
Yeah, it's definitely not intuitive. The way we think about shapes based on our 3D world, it doesn't really translate well to these higher dimensions. It's like trying to imagine a new color. So mathematicians have had to develop these really powerful tools to help them wrap their heads around it. Topology is one of the most important ones. You could think of it as the study of shapes and what stays the same about them, even if you stretch them, twist them, bend them, but you can't tear them. Like if you have a rubber band, no matter how you contort it, it's still a loop, right? So topology is all about classifying these higher dimensional spaces called manifolds based on these fundamental properties. It's been a really long and challenging process.
That makes sense. So today we're going deep into the work of Susanna Heikkilä, a mathematician who's done some really fascinating work in this area. Her research has really pushed forward our understanding of what are called, get this, quasi-regularly elliptic four manifolds. And the stuff you sent over, it really helped me see how her findings fit into the history of this field and what the implications are.
Yeah, it can seem pretty theoretical at first glance, but at its heart, it's about like the very nature of shapes in four dimensions. How can they be changed, transformed, mapped onto each other while still following certain rules? It's like, think of it this way. You have a piece of clay. You can mold it, shape it, but you can't like add more clay or take some away. You're just changing its form, but not its fundamental essence. That's what we're talking about here.
So let's jump into the big question here. The unsolved problem that Heikkilä's work helped to solve. It has to do with these four manifolds and whether they allow these special mappings, right? Like deformations, but with certain rules. Quasi-regular mappings, I think they're called. And this all starts with that four-dimensional flat space, the kind of space we can at least try to imagine.
Yeah, exactly. So picture this four-dimensional space. It's kind of like the 2D plane we know, but with two extra dimensions. Now, imagine taking that space and applying these specific types of deformation, these quasi-regular mappings, to create different shapes. Those are the four manifolds. They're basically spaces that, if you zoomed in on any little piece of them, they would look flat, just like that four-dimensional space. Like take the surface of a ball. If you zoom in really close, any tiny part looks flat, even though the whole ball is curved, right? A four-manifold is like that, but in four dimensions.
Okay, I'm sort of getting it. So we have these four manifolds, but what makes quasi-regular mappings so unique? It sounds like a very specific kind of transformation.
Oh, they are. They're kind of like a relaxed version of conformal mappings, which are those mappings that preserve angles. Imagine a map of the Earth. Those projections that try to represent a round surface on a flat piece of paper. Some of them distort sizes, like Greenland looking huge, but the angles between the lines stay the same. That's conformal. Quasi-regular mappings are a little more flexible. They allow for a bit of angle distortion, but there's a limit. The angles can only change so much under these mappings.
And this is where Susanna Heikkilä's work really shines. It's a big deal too, right? I mean,
Yeah.
Getting published in the Annals of Mathematics, that's not just any journal.
No, not at all. Annals of Mathematics is like the top journal in the entire field of mathematics.
Yeah.
So for research, especially from a doctoral thesis, to be published there, it's a really big deal. Because her work is like top tier, really significant stuff. And this was a collaboration with Professor Pekka Pankka addressing this really fundamental question, which four manifolds can have these quasi-regular mappings applied to them.
Now, the sources you gave me, they talk about this big question asked by a mathematician named Mikhail Gromov way back in 1981. What was he asking, and why was it such a big deal in the field?
Gromov, he's like a rock star in the math world. He asked this seemingly simple question. If you have a target space, a four-manifold in our case, and it has this property called simple connectedness, does that automatically mean there's a quasi-regular mapping from flat four-dimensional Euclidean space to it? Now, simply connected, that's a key concept in topology. It basically means a shape doesn't have any holes or separate disconnected parts. Like a sphere, it's simply connected. But a donut, a torus, that's not simply connected because of the hole in the middle.
So he was basically saying if it has no holes, it must be well-behaved enough to allow these special mappings.
Right. And it was a question that puzzled mathematicians for decades. Until 2019, when Alexander Priwas came along and he found a counterexample, a four-dimensional one. That was a huge deal because it proved that Gromov's initial idea that just being simply connected was enough, well, it was wrong.
So Pry said, nope, that's not always true. And Heikkilä steps in to figure out which simply connected four manifolds do allow these mappings.
Yeah, exactly. Her main result, it gives us a way to classify, to categorize all those closed, simply connected four-dimensional manifolds that do have a quasi-regular mapping from Euclidean space.
Yeah.
It goes beyond just saying, yes, they exist, to actually pinpointing exactly which ones they are. It's like making a list of all the possible shapes that fit the bill.
And this is where it gets really cool, because I read that Heikkilä used a very interesting way to explain her research. Knitting. I mean, how do you explain something so complex with knitting?
It's actually a brilliant example of how you can take really abstract math and make it more tangible. She used knitting during her dissertation defense, or public defense. She wanted everyone, even people who weren't math experts, to kind of understand the idea of quasi-regular mappings. So she used this knitted chessboard and a colored ball. It's called the Alexander map.
A chessboard and a ball. That's super creative. But how does that explain these mappings?
So imagine this flat knitted chessboard. But think of it as representing a part of that flat plane we talked about before, but in a higher dimension, like a slice of four-dimensional space. And she used different colored patches to make the squares, with different colors at the corners. Then she had a ball, and she had the top half one color and the bottom half another, representing a sphere. Now, if you try to wrap that flat knitting around the ball, perfectly match up the corners, well, you'll run into a problem. You can't do it without getting gaps or overlaps.
Ah, right. A flat thing can't wrap perfectly around a curved thing without some distortion.
Exactly. And those gaps that you have to close up by stretching the knitting, that's basically what quasi-regular mappings allow. Controlled stretching or distortion to map one space onto another. You can't perfectly wrap that knitting without doing some manipulating, and that's what shows the constraints and the possibilities with these mappings.
That's a really neat analogy. It helps to visualize something that's impossible to actually see. And it's pretty awesome that someone working on such advanced math would come up with such a simple way to explain it. It says a lot about her approach to problem solving. Speaking of which, her path to math, it wasn't like a straight line, right?
Yeah, when she was in upper secondary school, she wasn't totally set on math as a career. But she had this form teacher who also taught math, and he saw her talent, really encouraged her to pursue it at the University of Helsinki. It was in her second year in a topology course with, you guessed it, Professor Pankka, that her passion for math really took off. And that course, that's where it all started, that research collaboration that led to all this amazing work.
And her talent was obvious early on. She even won an award for her master's thesis, right?
Yeah, her thesis was titled, get this, Restricted Cohomology of Quasi-Regularly Elliptic Manifolds. It's a mouthful. But anyway, it won a very prestigious award given by the Academic Association for Mathematics and Natural Sciences, MAL, and the Academic Engineers and Architects in Finland, Tech. These fields are super important in Finland, so this award is a big deal. It recognizes how good her research was, even back then. And what's interesting is that her master's thesis was so in-depth that it basically became her first published article in her doctoral studies. It was pretty much ready to go.
That's incredible. So let's zoom out a bit. Where do these quasi-regular mappings fit into the larger world of math? The papers mention something called quasi-conformal geometry.
So quasi-conformal geometry, it basically studies how shapes change when you distort them in tiny, infinitesimal ways. It's all about these mappings. They don't necessarily preserve angles perfectly, but they do so in a very controlled manner. And quasi-regular mappings are like the tools of the trade in this area, especially when studying covering questions, like how one space can cover another through these mappings. A classic example, the sources talk about holomorphic mappings. Those are really strict angle-preserving mappings, from the complex plane to Riemann surfaces. And it turns out there are similar limitations for quasi-regular mappings in this 2D world.
Wait, hold on. Why is the complex plane in 2 dimensions so special here?
It's all tied to this thing called the uniformization theorem. Basically, it says the only Riemann surfaces, which are like 2D surfaces that look like the complex plane if you zoom in, the only ones that can have these non-trivial holomorphic mappings, and quasi-regular mappings too, from the whole complex plane, are the sphere and the torus. So you can't have these mappings to more complicated surfaces, the ones with more handles. We've known this for a while, thanks to Poincaré and Rodin way back in the early 1900s. It's like a fundamental concept in the theory of Riemann surfaces.
Okay, so in 2 dimensions, these mappings are pretty restricted, but things change a lot in higher dimensions, like the 4 dimensions Heikkilä is working in, right?
Right. In higher dimensions, things get much more complex. You see this big difference between conformal mappings, the ones that are strict about preserving angles, and quasi-conformal mappings, which are more flexible. Mathematicians like Martillo, Rickman, Devisele, and Zurich with his theorem, they showed that when you go to higher dimensions, the only simply connected spaces that allow a conformal mapping from Euclidean space are Euclidean space itself and spheres. But here's the kicker. Quasi-regular mappings, they can exist from Euclidean space to way more types of spaces in higher dimensions. Those are the quasi-regularly elliptic manifolds that Heikkilä is focused on. It really highlights how our intuition from lower dimensions can be totally off in these higher realms.
Which leads us back to Gromov's question. Remember, he was asking about whether there are closed, simply connected manifolds in higher dimensions that aren't quasi-regular elliptic. He was looking for some fundamental roadblock.
Yeah, he was. He figured there might be something called a homological obstruction, like something about how these spaces are fundamentally connected, their homology, that would prevent these quasi-regular mappings from existing. Bonk and Heinonen, they provided a partial answer using de Rham cohomology, which is basically a way to use calculus to understand the shape and holes of these spaces. But Priwe's work in 2019, that gave a more complete answer. He showed that the de Rham cohomology of a quasi-regularly elliptic manifold is limited by that of the n-torus, the higher dimensional donut.
And Heikkilä and Pankka come in and provide what they call an algebraic answer to Gromov's question. What does that even mean?
Professor Pankka, he explains it this way. For a closed manifold to be quasi-regularly elliptic, the way its submanifolds, like smaller shapes within the big shape, the way they intersect, has to be compatible with how submanifolds intersect in normal Euclidean space. In math terms, that means there has to be something called an algebra monomorphism, basically a map that preserves the structure, from the de Rham cohomology of the manifold to the exterior algebra of Euclidean space. The exterior algebra, think of it like a way to represent how directions combine in space.
Okay, that's a lot to take in. But this algebraic condition, it basically helps them determine if a manifold can even be quasi-regularly elliptic. So how does this tie into their actual classification of these four manifolds?
It's powerful because it lets them show that certain closed manifolds, even those that aren't super complicated topologically, they can't be quasi-regularly elliptic because they don't meet this condition. They don't pass the test, so to speak. By combining this with other important work, especially on the structure of four manifolds, they were able to come up with a full classification.
And what is that classification? Like, what are the closed, simply connected, quasi-regularly elliptic four manifolds? Can you describe them?
Building on work by Pirgalini and Zudis on something called branched covering representations and the foundational work of Donaldson and Friedman on classifying closed four manifolds, they were able to conclude that these are precisely the manifolds that you can build by taking up to 3 connected sums of the product of two spheres, that's written as S, ESS SOT, or by taking the connected sum of up to 3 two-dimensional projective spaces, written as RP, with either of the 2 possible orientations. It's a lot of technical jargon, but basically they nailed down exactly which shapes fit the bill, wrapping up a line of research that started with Seppo-Rickman.
That's pretty huge. They answered a question that's been puzzling mathematicians for decades. What's next for Heikkilä? What's she working on now?
She's currently a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Jyväskylä. She's still diving deep into the theory of quasi-regular mappings and curves, and she's looking for funding to support her research, which, is essential for any scientist.
It's cool to hear about her personal life, too, how she met her spouse in the same field, but they made a pact not to talk math at home after work. It's nice to see that human side, that even mathematicians need a break from thinking about, four-dimensional shapes sometimes.
Absolutely. We all need a bit of balance, right? Even when working on incredibly abstract concepts.
So just to wrap things up, what's the big takeaway for someone trying to understand the importance of Heikkilä and Pankka's work? What's the core message?
They've moved our understanding of four-dimensional spaces forward by leaps and bounds. They've drawn clearer lines around how these spaces can be deformed using quasi-regular mappings. They've built on decades of work in topology and answered a fundamental question that Gromov posed. And it opens up new paths to explore the properties of these special four-dimensional spaces.
And the fact that they can explain something so complex using knitting, that just blows my mind. It shows the power of creativity and out-of-the-box thinking, even in the world of math.
I agree. It's a great reminder that even the most mind-boggling concepts can sometimes be understood with simple visual examples.
It makes you wonder, if the rules of deformation are so different in higher dimensions, what other basic things about space itself might be different than what we assume? I mean, what else might we be missing?
That's a really profound thought. It really makes you question our understanding of the universe. Maybe our 3D view is just a tiny glimpse of a much bigger, more intricate reality out there.
If any of our listeners want to learn more about this fascinating research, you can find the full article, De Ram Algebras of Closed Quasi-Regularly Elliptic Manifolds Are Euclidean, by Susanna Heikkilä and Pekka Pankka in the Annals of Mathematics. The DOI is 10.4007 annals.2025.201.2.3. If you're curious, I definitely recommend checking it out.